In the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace, where protocol governs every breath and tradition weighs heavier than crown jewels, a 7-year-old princess would break every rule of royal etiquette in a desperate moment that would change 2 lives forever. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning would spiral into a heart-stopping crisis that no amount of royal training could have prepared anyone for.
And Princess Charlotte pressed a crumpled 5-pound note into the gloved hand of Senior Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell and whispered those 6 words that would haunt him for months to come. Neither of them knew they were about to embark on a journey that would test the very foundations of duty, family, and what it truly means to serve the crown. This is not just another story about royal privilege or palace intrigue. This is the raw, unfiltered account of how a child's love for her mother collided with the rigid world of royal protocol, and how one guard's decision to listen to his heart instead of his handbook would either save a life or cost him everything he had worked for. In a world where every move is calculated and every emotion must be contained, sometimes it takes the innocent desperation of a child to remind us what really matters. Thomas Mitchell had been a royal guard for 12 years, and he thought he had seen everything the palace could throw at him. From state dinners where world leaders argued over seating arrangements, to Christmas mornings when the youngest royals ran through hallways in their pajamas. He had maintained his composure through it all. Standing at 6 feet 2 in shoulders that had earned him respect in both the military and royal service, Thomas was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying a word. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing, and his ability to remain invisible while being completely alert had made him one of the most trusted guards in the palace. The morning of Tuesday, March 15th started like any other. Thomas arrived at Kensington Palace at 5:30 in the morning. His black uniform pressed to perfection. His boots polished to a mirror shine. The early morning briefing was routine. The Prince and Princess of Wales had no public engagements scheduled. The children would be attending their regular classes, and security was at standard level. Nothing in the morning report suggested that this would be anything other than another quiet day in the royal household. As Thomas took his position outside the private family quarters, he noticed the unusual silence that had settled over the palace in recent weeks. The staff moved more quietly than usual, their conversations conducted in hushed whispers that stopped whenever a member of the royal family appeared. He had been trained not to ask questions about family matters, but his instincts told him that something was troubling the household. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had always been one of the most approachable members of the royal family. Unlike some royals who treated the staff as invisible furniture, she remembered birthdays, asked about family members, and always said thank you for even the smallest services. But lately, Thomas had noticed changes in her demeanor. She moved more slowly through the corridors. Her usually bright smile seemed forced, and there were dark circles under her eyes that even the best makeup couldn't completely hide. The children, particularly Princess Charlotte, seemed to sense the change in their mother's energy. Charlotte, who was normally a bundle of curiosity and mischief, had become quieter and more observant. Thomas often caught her watching her mother with the kind of intense focus that seemed far too mature for a 7-year-old. Prince George, being older, tried to maintain his usual routine, but even he seemed more subdued during their daily walks through the palace gardens. On this particular morning, Thomas was stationed near the breakfast room when he first heard the raised voices coming from within. It was unusual for any arguments to occur in the family quarters, but what made it more concerning was that he could clearly hear the distress in Catherine's voice. The conversation was muffled by the heavy oak doors, but the tension was unmistakable. He positioned himself so that he could respond quickly if needed, while maintaining the appropriate distance that protocol required. About an hour later, Prince William emerged from the breakfast room, his face set in the kind of grim expression that Thomas had learned to recognize from his years of service. William's jaw was clenched, and he moved with the sharp, controlled movements of someone trying to contain strong emotions. He nodded briefly to Thomas before striding down the corridor toward his private office, his footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. It was then that Thomas heard the soft crying coming from the breakfast room. The sound was so quiet that anyone without his trained hearing might have missed it, but to Thomas it was as clear as a fire alarm. His first instinct was to check on the situation, but protocol dictated that he remain at his post unless specifically called upon. The internal struggle between his duty to protect and his duty to maintain appropriate boundaries was one that every royal guard faced, but it never became easier. The crying continued for several more minutes before it gradually faded into silence. Thomas remained at his position, his senses heightened and his mind running through various scenarios that might require his intervention. He had dealt with medical emergencies before, from fainting spells during long ceremonies to more serious incidents that required immediate medical attention. His training had prepared him to respond to physical threats, but the emotional distress of the royal family presented a different kind of challenge. When Princess Charlotte emerged from the breakfast room nearly an hour later, Thomas immediately noticed that something was different about her usual demeanor. The little girl who normally greeted him with a cheerful good morning, and sometimes a mischievous question about whether he had to stand still all day, was subdued and pale. Her blonde hair, usually perfectly styled for her morning lessons, looked as though she had been running her fingers through it, and her school uniform was slightly wrinkled. Charlotte paused near Thomas's position, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to hold far too much worry for someone her age. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then appeared to think better of it, and continued down the hallway toward the schoolroom where her governess was waiting. But something in her expression stayed with Thomas throughout the morning, a look of desperate concern that seemed entirely out of place on the face of a 7-year-old. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing the beginning of something significant. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him that the royal family was dealing with something far more serious than the usual pressures of public life. The careful way the staff avoided discussing family matters, the hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, and the obvious distress he had witnessed all pointed to a situation that was being carefully managed and closely guarded. During his lunch break, Thomas found himself thinking about his own family. His daughter Emma was about Charlotte's age, and he tried to imagine how she would react if she sensed that something was seriously wrong with her mother. Children, he knew, were far more perceptive than adults often gave them credit for. They picked up on changes in routine, shifts in emotional energy, and the unspoken tensions that adults thought they were hiding. The thought of his own daughter carrying that kind of worry made his chest tighten with sympathy for the young princess. When Thomas returned to his afternoon post, he noticed that the atmosphere in the palace seemed even more strained than it had been in the morning. Staff members moved with the kind of careful efficiency that suggested they were all walking on eggshells, and there was a palpable sense that everyone was waiting for something to happen. The afternoon lessons proceeded as scheduled, but even the children's tutors seemed more subdued than usual. It was around 3 o'clock when Thomas first noticed Princess Charlotte behaving strangely. Instead of going directly to her afternoon activities, she lingered in the corridors near his position, appearing to be deep in thought about something. She would start to approach him, then seem to lose her nerve and wander away, only to return a few minutes later. This pattern continued for nearly half an hour, and Thomas began to wonder if she wanted to tell him something, but wasn't sure how to approach him. The protocol for interacting with the royal children was clear. Guards were to be polite and responsive when spoken to, but they were not to initiate conversations or encourage inappropriate familiarity. Thomas had always found this balance challenging when it came to Charlotte, who had inherited her mother's natural warmth and her father's curiosity about the world around her. She often asked him questions about his job, whether he ever got tired of standing still, and whether he had ever met any famous people besides her family. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas became increasingly concerned about Charlotte's behavior. She seemed unable to concentrate on her lessons, and her governess had to call her attention back to her work several times. During what should have been a break for afternoon tea, Charlotte barely touched her food, instead staring out the window with a distant expression that reminded Thomas uncomfortably of the look he had seen on her mother's face that morning. The final incident of the day occurred just before dinner. Thomas was conducting his routine patrol of the family quarters when he heard voices coming from Catherine's private sitting room. The door was slightly ajar, and while he couldn't make out the words being spoken, he could hear the emotional intensity of the conversation. There were at least 3 voices: Catherine's, William's, and what sounded like an older woman who might have been Catherine's mother or perhaps a medical professional. As Thomas paused to assess whether his presence might be needed, he caught sight of Princess Charlotte standing at the far end of the hallway. She was pressed against the wall, clearly trying to listen to the conversation in her mother's room. Her small body was rigid with concentration, and even from a distance, Thomas could see that she was trembling slightly. The sight of the young princess desperately trying to understand what was happening to her family stirred something deep in Thomas's chest. He thought again of his own daughter, and how helpless he would feel if he were 7 years old and sensing that something was terribly wrong but not understanding what it was. The desire to comfort Charlotte warred with his professional obligations, creating an internal conflict that would only intensify in the days to come. When Charlotte finally noticed Thomas watching her, she immediately straightened up and tried to look as though she had simply been walking down the hallway. But the guilty expression on her face and the tears she was trying to hold back made it clear that she was struggling with emotions far too complex for her age. She looked at Thomas for a long moment, and he saw in her eyes a plea for help that she didn't know how to voice. As the day came to an end,
and Thomas prepared to hand over his duties to the night shift, he found himself breaking one of his own rules. Instead of focusing solely on security concerns and protocol requirements, he was thinking about the emotional well-being of the family he was sworn to protect. The image of Princess Charlotte standing alone in that hallway, trying to understand why her world seemed to be falling apart, would stay with him through the night and into the following day. That evening, as Thomas drove home to his own family, he made a decision that would ultimately change everything. If Princess Charlotte needed help, even if she didn't know how to ask for it properly, he would find a way to provide it without compromising his position or violating the trust that had been placed in him. He had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, that decision would be put to the ultimate test in a way that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, loyalty, and the true meaning of service to the crown. The next morning brought with it an atmosphere of barely contained crisis that Thomas could feel the moment he stepped through the palace doors. The usual morning briefing was conducted in whispers, with Security Chief Margaret Phillips speaking in the kind of measured tones that suggested she was working very hard to maintain normal procedures under abnormal circumstances. The overnight reports mentioned several calls from medical professionals, unusual activity in the family quarters, well past normal bedtime hours, and a request for complete privacy that extended beyond the usual media restrictions. Thomas took his position with a heightened sense of alertness, every instinct telling him that whatever had been brewing yesterday was about to come to a head. The staff moved through their routines with the mechanical precision of people who were operating on autopilot while their minds were occupied with more pressing concerns. Even the palace dogs seemed to sense the tension, moving more quietly through the corridors and staying closer to their handlers than usual. The first sign that this would not be an ordinary day came at 7:30 in the morning, when Thomas observed Catherine making her way slowly down the main corridor toward the breakfast room. Her movements were careful and deliberate, as though each step required conscious effort. She was dressed in a simple navy dress, but even from a distance Thomas could see that she was paler than usual, and that there was something fragile about her posture that hadn't been there even a week before. What struck Thomas most forcefully was the way Prince William hovered nearby, maintaining the appearance of casual conversation, while obviously monitoring every step his wife took. William's protective instincts had always been strong, but this level of vigilant concern suggested something far more serious than the usual pressures of royal life. When Catherine paused to steady herself against the wall, William was beside her instantly, his hand on her elbow in a gesture that managed to be both supportive and discreet. The children's reactions to their mother's condition became apparent during the morning lessons. Prince George, at 10 years old, was clearly working hard to maintain his composure and act normally. But Thomas noticed that he kept glancing toward the door as though expecting news that he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Prince Louis, being younger, seemed more confused than worried, but even he was quieter than usual, and stayed closer to his tutors. It was Princess Charlotte, however, who showed the most obvious signs of distress. During what should have been her favorite subject, art class, she sat staring at her blank paper for nearly 20 minutes without making a single mark. When her instructor gently asked if she needed help choosing what to draw, Charlotte simply shook her head and continued staring at the empty page as though it contained answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. Around mid-morning, Thomas received word through his communication device that there would be a private meeting in the family quarters, and that all non-essential staff should maintain extra discretion. This type of notification usually meant that sensitive family business was being discussed, and it often involved medical professionals or other specialists who required absolute privacy to do their work. As the morning progressed, Thomas began to notice a pattern in Princess Charlotte's behavior. Every time a new person entered the family quarters, whether it was a staff member, a visitor, or one of the other security personnel, Charlotte would appear in the corridor to observe them carefully. She wasn't being obvious about it, but her sudden appearances in various doorways, and her intense focus on anyone who might have information about her mother's condition, suggested that she was conducting her own investigation into what was happening. The breakthrough moment came just before noon when Thomas was standing near the entrance to the family quarters, and Charlotte emerged from her mother's sitting room with tears streaming down her face. When she realized he had seen her, she stopped abruptly and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts embarrassment and desperation. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thomas knew that protocol dictated he should either ignore what he had witnessed or perhaps notify her governess that the princess was upset. But something in Charlotte's eyes stopped him from following standard procedure. She looked like a child who was drowning in emotions she couldn't understand and desperately needed someone to throw her a lifeline.
"Your Royal Highness,"
Thomas said quietly, using the formal address that was required, but infusing it with as much warmth as he could manage within the bounds of propriety. "Are you quite all right?" Charlotte looked around quickly to make sure they were alone, then stepped closer to Thomas. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke, and he had to lean slightly toward her to hear what she was saying. Something is wrong with Mama, she said, her lower lip trembling with the effort of holding back more tears. Everyone keeps saying she's fine, but I know she's not fine. I can hear them talking when they think I'm not listening, and Mama looks scared all the time now. Thomas felt his heart clench at the raw honesty in her voice. This was exactly what he had feared, that Charlotte was being kept in the dark about something serious, while being expected to act as though everything was normal. The strain of pretending not to notice her mother's obvious distress while having no understanding of what was causing it was clearly taking a toll on the young princess. Adults sometimes have problems that are difficult to explain to children, Thomas said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that every syllable could have consequences. But that doesn't mean that the adults don't love you or that they're trying to hide things to hurt you. Charlotte studied his face intently, as though trying to determine whether he was going to tell her the truth or give her another version of the reassurances she had obviously been hearing from everyone else. But what if something really bad happens to Mama? She asked, her voice breaking on the words.
What if she has to go away like Grandmama Diana did? The reference to Diana stopped Thomas cold. He had served the royal family long enough to understand the profound impact that William's mother's death had had on the entire family, and the thought that Charlotte was connecting her current fears to that tragedy made the situation infinitely more heartbreaking.
A 7-year-old shouldn't have to worry about losing her mother, especially not when she had already heard family stories about the devastating loss that had shaped her father's entire life. Princess Charlotte, Thomas said, abandoning formal protocol in favor of the kind of direct honesty that the situation seemed to require, I don't know exactly what's happening with your mother, but I do know that she has a lot of people taking very good care of her.
Sometimes when adults are worried or not feeling well, it can seem scary to children. But that doesn't mean that the worst thing you can imagine is going to happen. Charlotte nodded slowly, but Thomas could see that his words weren't providing the reassurance she needed.
She was clearly intelligent enough to recognize the difference between generic comfort and specific information, and what she wanted was the truth about her mother's condition. Can I tell you a secret? She asked suddenly, glancing around again to make sure they weren't being overheard. Thomas nodded. Even though he knew that agreeing to keep secrets with members of the royal family was a potentially dangerous departure from protocol. But Charlotte's obvious distress overrode his concerns about following proper procedures. I've been saving my pocket money, she whispered, reaching into the small purse she carried for special occasions. I have £5 that Grandpapa Charles gave me for my birthday, and I was going to buy something special with it. But if Mama needs medicine or doctors or something like that, I want to give the money to help her get better. The innocence and generosity of the gesture hit Thomas like a physical blow. The idea that this little girl was willing to give up her birthday money to help her mother was both touching and heartbreaking, particularly because it revealed how helpless she felt in the face of a situation she didn't understand.
That's very thoughtful of you, Your Royal Highness, Thomas said, his voice rougher than usual with emotion he was struggling to contain.
But I don't think money is what your mother needs right now. Then what does she need? Charlotte asked, her eyes filling with fresh tears. What can I do to help her? I've tried being extra good and not making any trouble, but she still looks sad all the time. I've tried making her special pictures and bringing her flowers from the garden, but nothing makes her smile the way she used to. The desperation in Charlotte's voice revealed the full extent of the burden she had been carrying. She had been trying to fix a situation that was far beyond her control or understanding, and her failure to make her mother better had left her feeling responsible for something that wasn't her fault. Sometimes, Thomas said carefully, the best thing we can do for people we love is just to let them know that we care about them. You don't have to fix what's wrong with your mother, Princess Charlotte. You just have to love her. And it sounds like you're already doing that perfectly.
Charlotte considered this for a moment, then shook her head with the determination of someone who refused to accept that there was nothing she could do to help. But there has to be something, she insisted.
In all the stories, when someone is in trouble, there's always something that can be done to help them. There's always a way to make things better. Thomas realized that Charlotte's worldview was still shaped by the fairy tales and children's stories where problems always had solutions and love always conquered adversity. The idea that some situations were beyond the control of even the most determined 7-year-old was a lesson in powerlessness that no child should have to learn, but one that life sometimes forced upon them anyway.
Oh!
You're right that love can make a huge difference, Thomas said, trying to find a way to acknowledge her determination while helping her understand the limits of what she could accomplish. But sometimes the way love helps isn't by fixing the problem directly. Sometimes love helps by making the person who's struggling feel less alone. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing this concept and trying to decide whether it was satisfactory. Finally, she looked up at Thomas with an expression that was both resigned and determined. Will you help me figure out how to make sure Mama knows she's not alone? She asked. I don't think the other adults are telling me the truth about how serious this is, but you seem different. You're not trying to pretend that everything is perfectly fine when it's obviously not. The request put Thomas in an impossible position. On one hand, he was moved by Charlotte's trust and her desperate need for an adult ally who would take her concerns seriously. On the other hand, involving himself in family dynamics beyond his security responsibilities could jeopardize his position and potentially create complications for everyone involved. I can't promise to have all the answers, Thomas said slowly, but I can promise to listen to you and to help you think through ways to show your mother that you love her and support her. Charlotte's face brightened slightly for the first time in days, and she impulsively reached out to squeeze Thomas's gloved hand.
This is the book. It's about history. Thank you, she whispered. I was starting to think that all the adults had decided I was too little to understand anything, even though I can see perfectly well that something is very wrong.
As Charlotte returned to her lessons, Thomas found himself reflecting on the conversation and wondering whether he had just made a commitment that would ultimately help or harm the young princess. He had no experience dealing with family medical crises, and he certainly had no training in helping children cope with the kind of uncertainty and fear that Charlotte was experiencing. But he did know that ignoring her distress wasn't an option, and he suspected that the adults in her life, despite their good intentions, were underestimating both her perceptiveness and her capacity to handle age-appropriate information about her mother's condition. The challenge would be finding a way to provide the support Charlotte needed without overstepping his boundaries or interfering with family decisions about how much the children should know. As the day wore on, Thomas noticed that his conversation with Charlotte seemed to have provided her with at least some relief. She was more focused during her afternoon lessons, and while she was still obviously worried about her mother, she seemed less frantic and desperate than she had been earlier. But Thomas also noticed that his own stress levels had increased significantly. He found himself monitoring the family quarters more closely, paying attention to conversations that were none of his business, and feeling personally invested in outcomes that were far beyond his control or responsibility. The professional distance that was essential to his job was beginning to erode, and he wasn't sure whether that was a dangerous development or simply an inevitable result of caring about the people he was sworn to protect. The day ended with another late-night meeting in Catherine's sitting room, and Thomas could hear the low murmur of serious conversations that continued well past normal bedtime. As he prepared to end his shift, he caught sight of Charlotte's bedroom door opening slightly and saw her small face peering out into the corridor, obviously trying to gather information about what was happening. The sight of the young princess conducting her own surveillance operation would have been amusing under different circumstances, but in the current situation it simply reinforced Thomas's growing conviction that Charlotte's need for honest information and emotional support was not being adequately addressed. He made a mental note to himself that tomorrow he would need to find a way to check in with her again, even if it meant continuing to bend the rules that governed his professional conduct. What Thomas didn't know as he headed home that night was that Charlotte had already decided to take more dramatic action. The conversation with him had convinced her that there was at least one adult who would take her seriously, but it had also reinforced her belief that the situation with her mother was more serious than anyone was willing to admit. And if the adults weren't going to tell her the truth, or help her find a way to make things better, then she would have to find her own solution to the problem. The third day dawned gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent London rain that seemed to seep into everything and everyone. Thomas arrived at the palace to find an atmosphere that was noticeably more strained than it had been even the day before. The morning briefing was conducted with the kind of crisp efficiency that suggested everyone was operating under significant pressure, and there were additional security measures in place that indicated something important was happening. Margaret Phillips pulled Thomas aside after the briefing to inform him that there would be medical professionals coming and going throughout the day, and that absolute discretion was not just preferred but essential. The way she emphasized the word essential made it clear that whatever was happening with Catherine's health had reached a critical stage that required immediate and serious attention. Thomas took his position with a heavy heart, knowing that his conversation with Princess Charlotte the previous day was about to become even more significant. If Catherine's condition was serious enough to require this level of medical intervention, then Charlotte's fears about her mother were not the product of a child's imagination, but a legitimate response to a genuine crisis. The first indication of how serious the situation had become came around 8 o'clock, when Thomas observed a team of medical professionals arriving at the palace. They moved with the kind of quiet urgency that suggested they were dealing with something that required immediate attention, but needed to be handled with extreme discretion. The fact that they were coming to the palace rather than Catherine going to a hospital indicated that either her condition was too serious for her to travel, or that the need for privacy was so paramount that normal medical protocols were being altered to accommodate it. Prince William was clearly struggling to maintain his composure as he greeted the medical team and escorted them to the family quarters. Thomas had seen William under pressure many times during his years of service, but he had never seen the future king look quite so strained and worried. The careful control that William normally maintained over his emotions was beginning to crack, and it was obvious that he was fighting to keep his fears from overwhelming his ability to function. The children's response to the increased activity in the palace was immediate and telling. Prince George became even more withdrawn than he had been the previous day, spending most of his morning lessons staring out the window rather than focusing on his work. Prince Louis seemed confused by the change in routine and kept asking his governess when he would be able to see his mother, questions that were answered with increasingly vague reassurances that did nothing to ease his anxiety. But it was Princess Charlotte's reaction that concerned Thomas the most. Rather than becoming more upset as the crisis intensified, she seemed to become more determined and focused. She moved through her morning routine with a sense of purpose that was unusual for a 7-year-old, and Thomas noticed that she was paying even closer attention to the comings and goings of the medical staff than she had been to the regular palace visitors. Around 10 o'clock, Thomas witnessed a moment that crystallized the full extent of Charlotte's desperation. He was stationed near the entrance to the family quarters when he saw Charlotte slip out of her classroom and make her way quietly down the corridor toward her mother's room. She moved with the careful stealth of someone who knew she wasn't supposed to be where she was going, but who was driven by something more powerful than her fear of getting in trouble. When Charlotte reached her mother's door, she stood outside for several minutes, clearly listening to the conversation taking place within. Thomas could see her small body tense as she heard whatever was being discussed, and he watched her press her hand to her mouth as though trying to keep herself from crying out loud. The sight of the young princess desperately trying to understand what was happening to her mother while being systematically excluded from information about her condition was one of the most heartbreaking things Thomas had ever witnessed in his years of service. After about 5 minutes, Charlotte seemed to make a decision. She straightened her shoulders, wiped her eyes, and walked purposefully back toward the area where Thomas was standing. When she saw him, her face took on an expression of grim determination that reminded Thomas uncomfortably of the look he had seen on William's face during particularly difficult moments. "I need to talk to you," Charlotte said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being observed. "It's important." Thomas nodded and gestured toward a small alcove where they could speak without being easily overheard. Charlotte followed him, clutching something in her small hand that Thomas couldn't quite identify. "I heard the doctors talking," Charlotte said without preamble, her voice steady despite the tears that were threatening to spill from her eyes. "They were using big words that I don't understand, but I could tell from their voices that they're very worried about Mama. And I heard Papa say something about needing to prepare for the worst, whatever that means." Thomas felt his heart sink as he realized that Charlotte had overheard exactly the kind of conversation that the adults in her life had been trying to protect her from. But he also recognized that denying what she had heard, or trying to convince her that she had misunderstood, would only add to her distress and confusion. "That must have been very frightening to hear," Thomas said carefully. "Sometimes when doctors are trying to figure out how to help someone, they have to talk about all the different possibilities, including the ones that might be scary to think about." Charlotte nodded impatiently as though she had already worked through that explanation and found it insufficient. "I know they have to think about bad things that might happen," she said, "but what I don't understand is why no one is trying to do everything possible to make sure the bad things don't happen. Everyone is just sitting around having meetings and making phone calls, but no one is actually doing anything to help Mama get better." The frustration in Charlotte's voice revealed the depth of her helplessness and her growing conviction that the adults around her were not taking action quickly or decisively enough to address the crisis. "Sometimes the most important help happens in ways that aren't obvious," Thomas said. "The doctors and your parents might be doing a lot of things to help your mother that you can't see because they're not happening in places where you would notice them." Charlotte shook her head firmly, clearly unconvinced by this explanation. "Maybe," she said, "but I still think more should be being done. And I think I know something that might help that no one else has thought of." She opened her small hand to reveal the crumpled 5-pound note that Thomas remembered from their previous conversation, along with what appeared to be a small piece of folded paper.
"I've been thinking about what you said about love making people feel less alone," Charlotte continued.
And I realized that maybe the problem isn't that Mama doesn't know we love her. Maybe the problem is that she thinks she has to be strong for all of us, and that's making her sicker because she can't rest properly. Thomas was struck by the sophistication of Charlotte's analysis. She had clearly been thinking deeply about her mother's condition, and had arrived at insights that suggested a level of emotional intelligence that was remarkable for someone her age.
"So what do you think might help?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious to hear Charlotte's perspective. "I think someone needs to tell Mama that it's okay for her to not be strong right now," Charlotte said.
I think someone needs to tell her that we'll all be okay while she focuses on getting better, and that she doesn't have to worry about taking care of us while she's sick. Charlotte unfolded the piece of paper in her hand to reveal a letter written in her careful, childish handwriting.
"I wrote this for Mama," she said, holding out the letter for Thomas to see. "I told her that I know she's sick, and that I'm not scared because I know she's going to get better. I told her that she should rest as much as she needs to and not worry about any of us. And I told her that if she needs anything special to help her get better, I have 5 pounds that she can have." Thomas read the letter quickly, his throat tightening with emotion as he took in Charlotte's earnest attempts to provide comfort and reassurance to her mother. The letter was full of spelling mistakes and grammatical errors, but the love and determination behind every word were unmistakable. "This is a beautiful letter, Princess Charlotte," Thomas said, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm sure your mother would be very touched to know how much you love her and want to help her. But I don't know how to give it to her," Charlotte said, her voice beginning to break with frustration. "Every time I try to see Mama, someone tells me she's resting or she's with the doctors or she's not feeling well enough for visitors. And I'm worried that if I wait too much longer, it might be too late." The fear in Charlotte's voice made it clear that she was operating under the assumption that her mother's condition was immediately life-threatening, and that any delay in providing comfort and support could have catastrophic consequences. "What do you think I could do to help?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected where this conversation was heading. "Could you give the letter and the money to Mama for me?" Charlotte asked, pressing both items into Thomas's hands. "I know you're not supposed to get involved in family business, but this isn't really family business. This is just one person trying to help another person who's sick. And you said you would help me figure out how to show Mama that she's not alone."
Thomas looked down at the letter and the 5-pound note in his hands, feeling the weight of Charlotte's trust and desperation. He knew that agreeing to deliver the letter would be a significant departure from protocol, and that it could potentially create complications if other family members felt that he had overstepped his boundaries.
But he also knew that Charlotte's need to feel useful and connected to her mother during this crisis was legitimate and important, and that the traditional channels for family communication were clearly not working for a 7-year-old who was desperate to provide comfort to someone she loved. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said slowly, "I think your mother would want to hear from you directly, but I understand that might not be possible right now given how busy everyone is with medical concerns. If you really want me to make sure your mother gets your letter and knows about your generous offer, I can find a way to do that." Charlotte's face lit up with the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her in days. "Really?" she asked. "You'll make sure she gets it?" "I'll make sure she gets it," Thomas promised, though he was already wondering how he was going to fulfill that commitment without creating a diplomatic incident. "And you'll tell her that I'm not scared," Charlotte added. "Second chance to turn." "You'll tell her that I know she's going to get better because she's the strongest person I know?" "I'll tell her exactly what you want me to tell her," Thomas said, moved by Charlotte's combination of love and determination. Charlotte threw her arms around Thomas's waist in an impulsive hug that violated every protocol governing physical contact between royal family members and security personnel, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to pull away from the desperate gratitude of a child who finally felt like someone was taking her seriously and helping her find a way to contribute to her mother's recovery. "Thank you," Charlotte whispered against his uniform jacket. "I knew you were different from the other adults. I knew you would understand that sometimes you have to break the rules to do the right thing." As Charlotte returned to her lessons with a lighter step than Thomas had seen from her in days, he found himself holding a letter and 5 pounds that represented a 7-year-old's entire strategy for saving her mother's life. The trust that Charlotte had placed in him was both humbling and terrifying, because he was acutely aware that his next actions could either provide her with the comfort she desperately needed, or disappoint her in a way that could damage her faith in adults permanently. Thomas spent the rest of the morning trying to figure out how to approach Catherine with Charlotte's letter without overstepping his bounds or creating awkward questions about his relationship with the young princess. He knew that timing would be crucial, and that he would need to find a moment when Catherine was accessible but not overwhelmed by medical appointments or family discussions. The opportunity came around noon, when Thomas noticed Catherine moving slowly through the corridor toward the garden conservatory. She was alone for the first time in days, and while she looked pale and tired, she also seemed to be seeking a few minutes of solitude away from the constant attention of medical professionals and worried family members.
Thomas waited until Catherine had settled on a bench in the conservatory before approaching her carefully. He cleared his throat softly to announce his presence without startling her. And when she looked up at him with questioning eyes, he realized that this was the moment when he would either fulfill Charlotte's trust or fail her completely. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said formally, "Princess Charlotte asked me to give you something, and she was very insistent that it was important for you to have it as soon as possible." Catherine's expression immediately shifted from mild curiosity to maternal concern. "Is Charlotte all right?" she asked. "She hasn't been in any trouble, has she?" "No, ma'am," Thomas said quickly. "She's not in trouble. But she is very worried about you, and she wanted to make sure you knew how much she loves you and wants to help you feel better." Thomas held out Charlotte's letter and the 5-pound note, watching as Catherine's eyes filled with tears when she realized what she was looking at. "She wanted you to have this," Thomas said. "And she wanted me to tell you that she's not scared because she knows you're going to get better. She said you're the strongest person she knows." As Catherine took the letter and money with trembling hands, Thomas realized that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would change everything for both mother and daughter, though he had no way of knowing whether the change would ultimately be for better or worse. Catherine sat in the conservatory for what felt like hours, though Thomas knew it had only been about 20 minutes. She read Charlotte's letter multiple times, holding it with the careful attention usually reserved for important state documents. The 5-pound note lay in her lap, and occasionally she would pick it up and turn it over in her hands, as though it were made of something far more precious than paper and ink. Thomas remained nearby, technically maintaining his security duties, but actually staying close enough to provide support if Catherine needed it. He had never seen her cry before, not in all his years of service, but watching her read her daughter's letter had broken down whatever emotional barriers she had been maintaining throughout her medical crisis. "Thomas," Catherine said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "how long has Charlotte known about my condition?" The question put Thomas in a difficult position. He knew that the family had been trying to protect the children from the full extent of Catherine's health problems, but Charlotte's letter made it clear that she was far more aware of the situation than anyone had realized. "I believe she's known that something serious was happening for several days, Your Royal Highness," Thomas said carefully. "She mentioned overhearing some conversations between you and Prince William, and she's been very observant about changes in routine in the presence of medical professionals." Catherine nodded slowly, as though this information confirmed something she had already suspected. "I thought we were protecting her by keeping the details private," Catherine said. "But perhaps we were just protecting ourselves from having to explain something that we didn't fully understand ourselves." She looked down at the letter again, and Thomas could see fresh tears beginning to form in her eyes. "She says she's not scared because she knows I'm going to get better," Catherine continued. "But what if she's wrong? What if I don't get better? How do I accept this kind of faith and love when I'm not sure I deserve it?" The vulnerability in Catherine's voice revealed the full extent of the fear and guilt she had been carrying throughout her illness. Thomas realized that while everyone had been focused on her physical recovery, no one had been addressing the emotional burden of being seriously ill while responsible for the welfare of 3 young children. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, choosing his words with the same care he would use in a diplomatic negotiation. "If I may say so, Princess Charlotte's faith in your recovery isn't based on wishful thinking. It's based on her knowledge of who you are as a person and as her mother. She's seen you overcome challenges before, and she believes in your strength because she's witnessed it firsthand." Catherine looked up at Thomas with an expression of surprise, as though she hadn't expected such a personal and insightful response from someone whose job was primarily concerned with security matters. "You've been talking to Charlotte about this, haven't you?" she asked, and Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he realized that his conversations with the young princess were about to be discovered. "She approached me yesterday, ma'am," Thomas said, deciding that honesty was his only viable option. "She was quite upset and needed someone to listen to her concerns. I hope I didn't overstep my bounds, but she seemed to need an adult who would take her worries seriously." Rather than anger, Catherine's expression showed something that looked like relief. "Thank goodness someone was listening to her," she said. "William and I have been so focused on managing the medical aspects of this situation that I think we've underestimated how much the children were picking up on our stress." "What did Charlotte tell you about how she's been feeling?" Thomas found himself in the unusual position of providing a briefing about a 7-year-old's emotional state to her mother, but he recognized that this conversation was exactly what Charlotte had been hoping for when she asked him to deliver her letter. "She's been very worried about your health, obviously," Thomas began, "but she's also been frustrated by what she perceives as a lack of action to help you get better. She feels helpless and wants to find a way to contribute to your recovery. She's also concerned that you might be making yourself sicker by trying to take care of everyone else instead of focusing on your own healing." Catherine was quiet for a long moment,
Clearly processing this information and perhaps recognizing the accuracy of her daughter's assessment. She's remarkably perceptive for someone her age, Catherine said finally. And she's probably right about my trying to maintain normal routines, when I should be concentrating on getting well. She loves you very much, Thomas said. And she's quite determined to help you, even if she's not sure what form that help should take. Catherine stood up carefully, still holding Charlotte's letter and the 5-pound note. I need to see her, she said. I need to thank her for this letter and let her know that her love and support mean more to me than any medicine or treatment ever could. Should I arrange for Princess Charlotte to come to you, or would you prefer to go to her? Thomas asked. I'll go to her, Catherine said with more energy than Thomas had seen from her in days. It's time I stopped hiding from my children and started being honest with them about what's happening, in an age-appropriate way. Thomas escorted Catherine to the schoolroom, where Charlotte was supposed to be having her afternoon lessons. When they arrived, they found Charlotte sitting at her desk but not paying any attention to her work. Instead, she was staring out the window with the kind of distant expression that suggested her mind was far from mathematics or literature. Charlotte, Catherine said softly from the doorway, and the little girl spun around with a look of shock and hope. Mama, Charlotte exclaimed, jumping up from her chair and running to embrace her mother. Are you feeling better? Did you get my letter? I got your letter, Catherine said, kneeling down to Charlotte's eye level despite the obvious effort it required. And I got your very generous offer to help pay for my medical care. Both gifts mean more to me than you could possibly understand. Charlotte studied her mother's face carefully, as though trying to assess whether Catherine was telling her the truth or simply being polite. Are you really going to get better? Charlotte asked. Or are you just saying that to make me feel better? The directness of the question caught Catherine off guard, and Thomas could see her struggling to find a response that would be both honest and appropriate for a child. I'm going to do everything I can to get better, Catherine said finally. The doctors are helping me, and Papa is taking very good care of me. But you're right that I haven't been doing a very good job of taking care of myself because I've been worried about all of you. But that's silly, Mama, Charlotte said with the bluntness that only children can get away with. We can take care of ourselves for a little while. We have Papa and all the nice people who work here. You should focus on getting well instead of worrying about us. Catherine laughed for the first time in weeks, a sound that made both Charlotte and Thomas visibly relax. When did you become so wise? Catherine asked, stroking Charlotte's hair. You're absolutely right. I have been trying to do too much, when I should have been resting and letting other people take care of things for a while. So you'll try to rest more? Charlotte asked hopefully. And you'll let the doctors help you without worrying about what we're doing? I promise I'll try, Catherine said. But I have one condition. Charlotte's eyes widened with concern, as though she was expecting her mother to ask for something she couldn't provide. I want you to promise me that if you're worried or scared about anything, you'll come and talk to me about it instead of keeping it to yourself. Catherine continued. Even if I'm sick, I'm still your mother, and I want to know what's happening in your life and how you're feeling, even if talking about it might make you more worried. Charlotte asked. Even then, Catherine confirmed, because not knowing what you're thinking and feeling is actually much more stressful for me than knowing the truth about your concerns. Charlotte considered this for a moment, then nodded seriously. Okay, she said. And I promise to tell you when I'm worried, but you have to promise to tell me the truth about how you're feeling too. Not scary details, but just whether you're getting better or worse, so I don't have to guess. The negotiation between mother and daughter was conducted with the kind of gravity usually reserved for international treaties, and Thomas found himself impressed by both Charlotte's maturity and Catherine's willingness to treat her daughter as a capable person deserving of honest communication. I promise, Catherine said, sealing the agreement with another hug. As Catherine prepared to return to her rest, Charlotte suddenly remembered something and turned to Thomas with a bright smile. Thank you for keeping your promise, she said. I knew you would find a way to help. Catherine looked between Thomas and Charlotte with obvious curiosity. What promise was that? She asked. Thomas promised to make sure you got my letter, Charlotte explained. And he promised to tell you that I'm not scared because I know you're going to get better. Catherine turned to Thomas with an expression of profound gratitude. Thank you, she said simply, for listening to Charlotte and for helping her feel heard during a very difficult time. It was my pleasure, Your Royal Highness, Thomas replied, though he knew the situation had been far more complex than pleasure. As Catherine and Charlotte walked together toward the family quarters, Thomas reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed in just a few hours. The desperate, frightened child who had pressed 5 pounds into his hands that morning had been transformed into a confident young girl, who felt heard and valued by the adults in her life. But Thomas also knew that the real test of this new honesty and communication would come in the days and weeks ahead. As Catherine's treatment progressed and the family learned to navigate the challenges of serious illness while maintaining the kind of openness that Charlotte had demanded.
That evening, Thomas received word that there would be a family meeting to discuss Catherine's treatment plan and how to involve the children in age-appropriate ways. The fact that such a meeting was happening at all was a direct result of Charlotte's courage in expressing her needs and concerns, and Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction at having played a small role in facilitating that communication. As he prepared to end his shift, Thomas realized that his relationship with the royal family had been fundamentally altered by the events of the past few days. He was no longer simply a security officer who protected them from external threats. He had become someone who understood the emotional dynamics of the family and who had been trusted with their most private concerns. The weight of that trust was both humbling and daunting, because Thomas knew that his actions in supporting Charlotte had set a precedent for how he would relate to the family going forward. He had crossed a line between professional distance and personal involvement, and while the outcome had been positive in this instance, he wasn't sure how to maintain that balance in future situations. But as Thomas drove home that night, he also knew that he wouldn't change anything about how he had handled Charlotte's crisis. Sometimes the most important service one could provide wasn't following protocol, but recognizing when human need transcended professional boundaries. Charlotte had needed an adult who would take her seriously and help her find a way to express her love for her mother, and Thomas was proud to have been able to provide that support when she needed it most. The 5 pounds that Charlotte had been willing to give up to help her mother recover would be returned to her, of course, but the love and determination behind that gesture had already accomplished something far more valuable than any monetary contribution could have achieved. It had opened up channels of communication that would help the entire family navigate the challenges ahead, and it had reminded everyone involved that sometimes the most powerful medicine is simply knowing that you are loved and supported by the people who matter most. 3 months later, Thomas stood in the same corridor where Princess Charlotte had first pressed her 5-pound note into his hands, but the atmosphere in the palace had transformed completely. The tension that had hung over the family quarters like a heavy cloud had lifted, replaced by something that felt remarkably close to normal family life. Catherine's treatment had been successful, and while she was still recovering her full strength, the crisis that had gripped the household had passed. The changes in the family dynamics, however, had proven to be lasting. The honest communication that Charlotte had demanded during her mother's illness had become a permanent feature of how the family dealt with both major and minor challenges. Thomas had observed numerous conversations over the past few months where the children were included in age-appropriate discussions about family decisions, health concerns, and even some aspects of their public duties. Princess Charlotte in particular had blossomed under this new approach to family communication. The anxious, desperate child who had been willing to give up her birthday money to save her mother had evolved into a confident young girl who knew that her thoughts and feelings were valued and respected by the adults in her life. She still asked Thomas about his job and whether he ever got tired of standing still, but now she also updated him regularly on her mother's progress and shared her excitement about family plans and activities. The morning that would mark the culmination of this story began like many others, with Thomas taking his position and conducting his routine security briefings. But today was special because it marked Catherine's return to her first full public engagement since her illness, a visit to a children's hospital that had particular significance for the entire family. As the family prepared for the engagement, Thomas noticed that there was an excitement in the palace that had been absent during the difficult months of Catherine's treatment. The staff moved with renewed energy, and even the children seemed more animated and cheerful than they had been since before their mother's diagnosis. Catherine herself was transformed. While she was still more careful about her energy levels and took more time to rest between activities, the drawn, frightened expression that had haunted her features during her illness had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like her old confidence and joy. She moved through the preparation for the public engagement with the grace and efficiency that had made her such an effective member of the royal family, but there was also a new depth to her interactions with both staff and family members. Princess Charlotte was particularly excited about the day's events, not just because her mother was returning to public duties, but because the family had decided to make this engagement a teaching moment about service, compassion, and using privilege to help others. Charlotte had been involved in planning some aspects of the visit, including helping to select books and toys that would be donated to the hospital's young patients. As the family prepared to leave for the engagement, Charlotte approached Thomas with a smile that reminded him of the very first time he had seen her, before the crisis that had brought them together in such an unexpected way. "Thomas," she said, using the informal address that had become acceptable between them after months of their special relationship,
I have something for you.
Charlotte held out a small wrapped package that she had obviously prepared herself, based on the enthusiastic but uneven application of wrapping paper and ribbon. "What's this for, Your Royal Highness?" Thomas asked, accepting the package with curiosity.
It's a thank you present, Charlotte explained, for helping me when Mama was sick and for listening to me when I needed someone to take me seriously. Thomas opened the package carefully, revealing a small framed photograph of the royal family that had been taken just a few weeks earlier.
It was clearly a personal photograph rather than an official portrait, showing Catherine and William with the 3 children in a candid moment of laughter in the palace gardens. Charlotte wrote something on the back, Catherine said, appearing beside her daughter with a warm smile.
She insisted on doing it herself. Thomas turned the frame over to find Charlotte's careful handwriting. Thank you for helping me save my mom. Love, Princess Charlotte. The simplicity and sincerity of the message hit Thomas harder than any formal commendation or recognition ever could. He realized that in Charlotte's mind he hadn't just delivered a letter or facilitated communication between mother and daughter. In her understanding, he had been an essential part of the process that had led to her mother's recovery. "Princess Charlotte," Thomas said, his voice rougher than usual with emotion. "This is one of the most meaningful gifts I've ever received. I'll treasure it always." "Do you really think I helped save Mama?" Charlotte asked, seeking confirmation of something she clearly wanted very much to believe. Thomas knelt down to Charlotte's eye level, remembering the desperate, frightened child who had been willing to give up everything she had to help her mother, and comparing her to the confident, happy girl standing before him now.
"I think your love and determination to help your mother made a huge difference in how your whole family handled a very difficult situation," Thomas said carefully. "You showed incredible courage and maturity, and you reminded all the adults around you that sometimes children have important things to contribute too." Charlotte beamed at this assessment, then surprised Thomas by giving him another one of her spontaneous hugs. "I'm glad you were the guard who was here when Mama was sick," she said. "I don't think any of the other guards would have understood what I needed." Catherine placed her hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable before the events that had brought them all closer together. "Charlotte is right," Catherine said. "You provided exactly the kind of support our family needed during the crisis, even though it wasn't part of your official duties. We'll never forget how you helped our daughter feel heard and valued when she most needed it." As the family departed for their public engagement, Thomas reflected on how dramatically his understanding of his job had evolved over the past few months. When he had first become a royal guard, he had focused primarily on physical security and protocol adherence. He had thought of his role as protecting the royal family from external threats while maintaining appropriate professional distance from their personal lives. But his experience with Charlotte's crisis had taught him that true protection sometimes meant recognizing when emotional and psychological needs were as important as physical safety. The desperate 7-year-old who had pressed 5 pounds into his hands hadn't been facing a security threat in any traditional sense, but she had been in genuine danger of feeling helpless and unheard during one of the most frightening experiences of her young life. By choosing to listen to Charlotte and help her find a way to express her love and concern for her mother, Thomas had provided a kind of protection that no amount of physical security could have achieved. He had protected her sense of agency and value as a family member, and he had helped preserve the trust and communication that were essential to the family's emotional well-being. The success of Catherine's treatment had obviously been due to the skill of her medical team and the support of her immediate family, but Thomas knew that Charlotte's letter and the conversations it had prompted had played a real role in creating an environment where healing could occur. When Catherine had stopped trying to protect everyone else from her illness and had started focusing on her own recovery, her progress had accelerated noticeably. Later that day, Thomas received word that the family's public engagement had been a tremendous success. Catherine had been warmly received by the hospital staff and patients, and the children had all conducted themselves beautifully during their first major public appearance since their mother's illness. Charlotte, in particular, had charmed everyone she met with her natural warmth and her obvious joy at being able to participate in her mother's return to public duties. But perhaps more importantly, the engagement had demonstrated to the public that the royal family had emerged from their private crisis stronger and more united than before. The honesty and communication that Charlotte had insisted upon during her mother's illness had created a foundation of trust that would serve them well in facing whatever challenges the future might bring. As Thomas prepared to end his shift that evening, he took out the framed photograph that Charlotte had given him and read her inscription again. "Thank you for helping me save my mom." The words would forever remind him that sometimes the most important service one could provide wasn't following protocol, but recognizing when human need transcended professional boundaries. The 5-pound note that had started this entire story was now framed and hanging in Charlotte's bedroom, not as legal tender,
but as a reminder of her determination to help someone she loved.
Catherine had insisted that Charlotte keep the money, explaining that while financial contributions weren't needed, the love and commitment behind the gesture were invaluable. The story of Princess Charlotte and the Royal Guard had become family legend, referenced whenever someone needed a reminder about the importance of listening to children, taking their concerns seriously, and recognizing that even the youngest family members had valuable contributions to make.
It had also become a touchstone for the kind of honest, open communication that the family was committed to maintaining going forward. Thomas's role in the royal household had been permanently altered by his decision to help Charlotte during her mother's crisis.
He was still a security officer, but he was also recognized as someone who understood the family's emotional dynamics and who could be trusted with their most personal concerns. It was a responsibility he took seriously, knowing that his actions had helped create a precedent for how the family dealt with future challenges. But perhaps most importantly, the experience had taught everyone involved that love, when expressed with courage and determination, really could change everything. Charlotte's desperate desire to help her mother had opened up channels of communication that strengthened the entire family. Her willingness to trust a guard with her deepest fears had created a relationship that enriched both their lives.
And her simple faith that love could overcome any obstacle had proven to be more powerful than any protocol or tradition. As Thomas drove home that night, he carried with him the knowledge that he had been part of something extraordinary.
A 7-year-old girl's love for her mother had transformed not just her family's ability to cope with crisis, but also his own understanding of what it truly meant to serve and protect the people who had been entrusted to his care. The £5 that Charlotte had been willing to sacrifice had purchased something far more valuable than any medicine or treatment. It had bought the chance for a family to face their fears together, with honesty, courage, and unshakable faith in the power of love to heal even the most frightening wounds. In the end, Princess Charlotte hadn't just handed a guard £5 and begged him to save her mother. She had taught everyone around her that sometimes the most powerful weapon against fear and helplessness is simply the courage to reach out for help and the determination to keep fighting for the people you love, no matter how impossible the situation might seem.